G'day everyone, it's Michael Beresford back again from OpenCorp for today's Property Wealth WOD. One of the most common questions that we get asked is, Michael, how many properties do I need to be financially secure? Now, that's a really generic question. It's going to depend on so many factors. It depends on how your properties are performing, what kind of properties you buy, what your income is, what your borrowing capacity is, what your goals are. What does financially secure mean for you? So what I would suggest is, first and foremost, like everything, this will sound like a broken record, guys, like everything we talk about, the two things that you need to understand before you even start looking at property are, number one, what is it that you want to achieve? Remember the taxi? You don't jump in the taxi without telling the taxi driver where you're going. So understand your destination. What does financially secure mean to you? That's the first step. Once you've got that worked out, it's then about understanding what your borrowing capacity is and what's your ability to take that first step or your next step if you've got investments already. Okay. So let's assume that you've got those two things out of the way. If not, really good exercise for tonight or on the weekend. Okay. Now, to understand how to get financial security and to achieve that goal figure that you have in terms of annual income, there are several ways to get there. And the key focus is not on how many properties you have. It's on how those properties perform and how they allow you to be able to achieve your goals. Okay, I can't be more clear on that. What I'm going to do is show you a diagram to demonstrate that more properties are not necessarily best. Okay. Now, a really common book out there is actually written by Steve McKnight. A lot of people I know that have read it. It's 0 to 130 properties in 2.5 years or something like that. And it was written a few years ago. And what Steve's model was that by buying cash flow positive properties, that would allow you to be able to have the borrowing capacity to get more money from the bank and so on and so forth. Now, that process worked back then for Steve. But as property prices have grown, even in regional areas, where he was predominantly buying these properties, the capital requirement for the next deposit was too great, because while those properties were bringing in a lot of cash flow, they weren't growing in value at a necessary rate to allow him to duplicate that process. So Steve's no longer doing that, he's doing something else. But it's a really good insight into what we're talking about around more is not necessarily better. Okay? And what I'm going to look at, I'm going to look at 3 different types of property, because there's not only the growth part, remember there's the cold hard out of our pocket, the cash flow that's required to hold these. So, number one, let's say we've got the big blue chip property in, say, Brighton for argument's sake. Then we've got a reasonable portfolio of middle ring house and land suburban type assets with a growth focus, and over here we're going to have, I won't draw 12 properties, but let's say that there are 12 properties with a cash flow focus. Okay, now this one here, let's say that this is $2 million worth. Okay, over here, let's say all of these are 500,000 each, so there's $2 million worth. Okay, and over here we've got 12 cash flow properties. Doesn't really matter what they're worth, because this is a cash flow focus. They're not going to be growing at a significant rate, but let's say that they're bringing in $100 per week each. Okay, so they're the 3 options that we're looking at. Now, if we look at cash flow, blue chip will grow well, obviously, but as you know, it's expensive to hold. And some quick numbers on today's interest rates mean that this property is going to be costing about $500 per week out of your pocket, so after rent, after tax, to hold. Now, that equates to $25,000 for the year. Not everyone's going to have that, and that's only one property. Okay, so if this is in Melbourne and the Melbourne market's not moving, that's a lot of coin out of your pocket for minimal growth. Over here, let's say that each of these cost you $50 a week. So that's pretty much worst case. And $50 a week across 4 is a total of $200 per week. So less than half what this one costs to hold the same amount of asset. Okay. Now if we look at the cash flow over here, $100 per week per property gives us $1,200 per week in cash flow. Okay, and that equates to $60,000 per annum. Okay, so when we're looking at financial security, let's assume that people want to replace their income. That's a fairly common goal that we have, and let's say that they earn about Australian average of 90 to 100k. All right, now on an income of 90 to 100k, you're not going to get borrowing capacity for this kind of property. You're definitely not going to have $25,000 disposable income to be able to hold that. So this one is not going to work. If we come over here and we say, well, 60,000 is pretty good positive cash flow, but it's just over half where we want to be. Okay, so rent will continue to go up, but it will take a long time to grow that to where we want to be as well over here. With these kind of properties, however, $200 per week equates to $10,000 per annum to hold these, but at 2 million growing on average at 8% is going to be 160k. Okay, so looking at net numbers, the 160 is what it grows by on average, minus the 10k it costs to hold them. The net position is 150. Have a look at the ones that we've talked about living off equity, guys, and just by tapping into 2/3 or about 60% of this annual growth, then you're able to get that goal of 90 to 100k per annum. Okay, so again, not necessarily how many properties you have. What you need to do is ensure that they are growth focused, not cash flow focused, and you need to make sure that what you buy is not a drain on your cash flow so that you can hold several of them and get compound growth. So for those of you that are out there wondering how many properties you need to be financially secure, number 1, work out what financial security means for you. Number 2, work out your time frame and most importantly your borrowing capacity. And then 3, stick to a proven process where you're not draining your cash flow so you can get compound growth.